I'm Warren Smith with World News Group. Tim Dalrymple was an elite athlete on the nationally ranked Stanford University gymnastics team when a serious injury ended his sports career. But as one door closed, another opened. His departure from the world of athletics allowed him to focus on his intellectual pursuits, which he did with the same passion and excellence he had brought to athletics. After graduating from Stanford, he earned a Master of Divinity degree from Princeton Theological Seminary and a PhD from Harvard. But it is as a digital entrepreneur that Tim Dalrymple is making his mark. He helps lead Patheos, a multi-religious site that since its startup in 2010 has grown to tens of millions of page views a month, in part because of the strength of the evangelical portal, which Tim edits. Patheos is based in Denver, but Tim lives in Atlanta. So I traveled there to visit with Tim at his home, which he shares with his wife Joyce and 2 young daughters. After a quick tour of his office, more about that in a few minutes, we sat down for a conversation about suffering, his sojourn through the elite universities of this country, and what it means to be an imitator of Christ.
From a very young age, gymnastics became a big part of my story. But it was always just a part. I was determined that I should develop myself, not just physically, but mentally and spiritually, and was very, probably for prideful reasons, very much into self-improvement. I won the national championships, the all-around national title, as a junior when I was 15. I had to figure out where to go for college. Stanford was about an hour away from where I was raised. It was also amongst the programs that have strong gymnastics, amongst the universities that have strong gymnastics programs. Stanford was, it seemed to me, the best place to go academically.
Now, and this is a bit of a stereotype, but I think a lot of people would say a young Christian boy going off to Stanford, that is an ideal recipe for that young Christian boy to lose his faith. That didn't happen to you.
Yeah, I think it really depends on the personality of the individual as well as the landscape of the Christian ministry at that particular school. So for myself, I've always been a kind of a contrarian. Whatever I find to be the prevailing assumptions around me, I tend to react against them. I'm not sure why. It may be a prideful thing. It's not as though I didn't wrestle with my faith, but I was plugged into a very vital Christian community there at Stanford. And in some ways, if I had to choose between going to a Christian college where everything might be sometimes a little bit lukewarm or assumed, and going to a secular university where there is a really living and vibrant Christian community, and you can get plugged in there, then in some ways I think that's even more promising.
So you were there, your faith was not destroyed, but in fact nurtured because of that Christian community. And then we come to that defining moment in your sophomore year in gymnastics?
Yeah, that's right. It was warm-ups for competition at the beginning of the season in my sophomore year. So this is February of 1996, not long before the Olympic trials for the Atlanta Games. And I had recently learned a new skill, which was a triple backflip dismount from the high bar. So the way that I would come off the bar at the end of the routine was to do a triple backflip dismount. But since it was new to me, it was still something I was scared of. And the way that I would respond to that would be to do it the first time I jumped up on the bar in warm-ups. Kind of almost like a cocky kind of, let me show that I can do it even on my first turn, and then I'll be fine. Let me get over my fear. Make a long story short, I went straight up over the bar. You're in a tuck so that you can rotate quickly. Came out of the tuck and dropped. I managed to miss the bar, but I landed partway on the mat, partway off at an awkward angle, ended up breaking 2 vertebrae pretty badly. What followed over the course of the next couple days was really the most profound experience of God's love that I had ever had to that point. People talk about where their spiritual mountaintop experiences are, and mine actually was, to that point in my life, it was there in that hospital room. The tide of people who were coming through, the very tangible experience of God's presence and love was a transformative moment for me.
Transformed to what? What happened after that?
Well, it became clear that my gymnastics career was over. So I had more time to devote to ministry. I ended up focusing in philosophy and religious studies, and even in the subject matter that I chose, I wanted to explore particularly the matter of suffering and how do we think through suffering in a systematic way, philosophically and theologically.
And I guess after what you had just been through, that was not just a theoretical question.
Yeah, and I didn't go into the topic because I thought I would necessarily have any special insight into it, because it was something that I experienced. We all experience suffering, and many more than, far more than I have. But I did feel like I could at least approach it with a certain sense of urgency, that it was a question that mattered to me, and that would help me endure through the long haul of a graduate school program and doctoral program. But certainly it was a matter that also allowed me to bring together my intellectual interests with my faith.
So, Tim, when you were at Princeton, you got married.
Yeah, I married a wonderful woman that I had, my college sweetheart, someone I had met through the Christian underground at Stanford.
And then from there, you moved on to Harvard and got your PhD. You studied Kierkegaard, who I understand remains a passion of yours.
Yeah, absolutely. The Harvard years were largely good years, and similar to my experience at Princeton Seminary, found students and faculty I really got along well with. And then being able to plunge into Kierkegaard for a number of years. Kierkegaard has a mixed reputation amongst evangelicals, but I think undeservedly so. I think a very kind of partial image of Kierkegaard has been bequeathed to evangelicals by the likes of Francis Schaeffer.
When you were finishing up at Harvard, on your way to becoming an academic, perhaps a college professor, that plan got derailed by Patheos. You started working for them as you ended your time at Harvard.
Yeah.
Tell us about Patheos and why you decided to take this, what some folks would consider to be a very different turn in your career.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I had always thought that I wanted to be hopefully a winsome voice at a secular university, a Christian voice. And by the time I reached the end of my PhD program, or neared the end of it, I was no longer convinced that that's what God wanted me to do. I was frustrated with secular academia as well, and felt as though it wasn't providing, in many ways, the kind of forum for open, thoughtful, charitable conversation on matters of ultimate import that it ought to be.
So you went to work for Patheos, and you run the evangelical channel for Patheos. Tell me a little about that and what it is that you hope to accomplish.
Well, I like to think that Patheos reproduces online the marketplace of religious ideas and hopefully makes it better. We want it to be more informed, more elevated, more charitable. And that was my passion. And that was how I was able to connect with the vision of the company. Because I was just tremendously frustrated, number one, with the appalling quality of online conversation about matters of religion. And number two, with, I thought, a not very effective evangelical self-representation in that multi-religious marketplace of ideas. So the opportunity to be a part of that and actually use my training, use my education, but in a very different way, was very appealing to me. So I came on as the managing editor of the Evangelical Channel, and I've helped that grow over the years. The Evangelical Channel has its own vision. Every channel operates to some extent as an independent entity, almost as a website within the website. And so the Evangelical Channel really tries to represent the gospel well within a multi-religious marketplace of ideas, to bring evangelical public intellectuals to bear on the most pertinent issues in the public square, and also to host the conversations that are shaping the future of the church.
Well, let's talk a little bit about those conversations because, a true conversation rather than just mimicry necessarily requires at least some diversity of opinion. If everybody believed the same, you couldn't really have a meaningful conversation. If ecumenism, though, sometimes gets a pretty bad rap because it is so mushy, so squishy, it doesn't stand for anything. How do you maintain that I don't know if it's a middle ground or a higher ground between those two relatively unhelpful extremes?
You have a spectrum from 0 to 100. Each channel tries to get at least 20 to 80. We want to get a good deal of diversity of opinion within that religious community, and then across Patheos as a whole.
What's the long-term goal for Patheos? I mean, you've come out of the gate pretty strong in the first few years, from 0 to well over 10 million page views a month now. And where do you go from here?
Our vision is to have the best writers in the world dealing with the most important questions in life. If we're able to do that, if we're able to create a meaningful multi-religious marketplace of ideas, my confidence as an evangelical, as a Christian, is that the gospel of the truth prospers, or at least finds the people who are genuinely seeking it. If you have that kind of fair marketplace where everybody can speak, and you speak the gospel, speak the word of God into that, and it does not return void.
Tim, we're creating this series on new Christian voices in part because, folks like you have achieved a level of success at your vocation, the calling that God has laid out for you. I have two questions I guess I would want to ask related to that. Number one is, how do you define success? And number two, what advice would you give to your peers or folks perhaps younger than you who are at a place where they perhaps haven't fully discerned what their vocation is, what God is calling them to?
Well, I don't think you can define success in terms of the outcomes. The outcomes are not in our control, and we know that there are stories in which God called prophets, for instance, to do things that were destined to failure. I think it's simple faithfulness. I know for myself, it's often easier to be faithful when people are watching. It's easier to be faithful when you're on stage. It's easier to kind of make a public demonstration of your faith. But because it's easier, that's not what I admire so much. What I admire more so is the kind of quiet, everyday faithfulness that I see in people who've been living their faith humbly year after year after year. So whether you've already discerned your vocation or whether you haven't, there is God calls each and every one of us to simple faithfulness, simple acts of faithfulness and love. And one of the things that I really gained, I think, from Kierkegaard is his emphasis on the imitation of Christ. And there's a great deal of conversation today, especially amongst kind of young Christian voices, about what is it that the American church is missing. And some think, well, it's that we need to be more radical, or it's that we need to be more purpose-driven, or all different sorts of theories, and it seems as though every book kind of has its own slogan for it. To me, it's a very old slogan. It's the imitation of Christ, that Christ calls us, if we're going to follow him, to pick up our cross daily and follow him that way. So if success is defined that way, then success is available to each and every one of us every day, not only to those who are finding some measure of professional flourishing.
When I arrived at Tim Dalrymple's office, I was intrigued by two small sculptures he keeps there. During a break in our conversation, I asked him to tell me about them. Tim, this is a really interesting sculpture of Sisyphus, who, of course, is the mythological figure who was constantly pushing the boulder uphill, and every time he would stop, it would roll back down on him. Why is this sculpture here, and what's its significance to you?
Yeah, I'm afraid this will come across legalistically or something, but I feel as though in the Christian life there's never a moment when you can just kind of stop and rest on the accomplishments that you've built or the maturity that you've gained. But instead, it is a constant struggle. It ought to be rooted in God's grace, and there ought to be a sense of peace about our salvation. And yet, the attempt to engage with God in the restoration of all things is a constant struggle that takes daily work and daily faithfulness.
This is an interesting sculpture, a muscled figure in front of a candle. What's the significance of that?
Yeah, I picked this up shortly after I broke my neck in the gymnastics accident. And there was a time after I had the surgery and came out of the hospital, I went to see a movie. And in the movie, a figure who's a monk goes up to a monastery, and it says, "Behold, I have refined you in the furnace of affliction." And hearing that just after having this life-changing injury really shook me in a good way. I mean, it broke me with gratitude. I felt broken into 1,000 pieces because I was so joyful to know that what I had just gone through was not in vain, but that God was using this to change me and to shape me for his purposes and shape me more into his likeness. And so when I saw this, I came across this, it just felt like, by that point I was a relatively muscular guy and strong by worldly standards, and yet here I had been broken in front of this light, both with a sense of grief at loss, but also with a sense of joy. And I see that in the light is very near to him, even in the midst of being a humble and contrite and broken figure.
Tim Dalrymple continues to serve as managing editor for the Evangelical Portal at Patheos, and he has also founded Polymath Innovations, a company that he describes as helping organizations doing morally significant work develop their digital voice. Reporting for World News Group's New Christian Voices series, I'm Warren Smith.